lot simpler.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I like that framing of helpful versus correct, because what I've found is that if it can get me 90% of the way there, then I have enough experience and expertise to like last mile pretty much any piece of code. And then I wonder where that, comes from 20 years of experience writing software, and like if you don't have that, what that experience is like. So I'd be interested in hearing from folks who are newer to the trade. When you get to that helpful but not correct place, are you stuck? Are you lost? Is it hand-holdy enough that you can cite sources and follow up and get that final place? I'd be interested to hear from folks if you've had that experience, because I can't go back and become an inexperienced developer again in order to understand it. Ty, you might have the hardest, no offense guys, you might have the hardest part of this because like you are the user interface into this world and its helpfulness. What have been some challenges? How have you guys overcome them? Even standing out in the crowd, because there's lots of people who are building like, hey, chat is the starting place, but it's certainly not the end of where these tools are going.
Definitely. This is a lot of the hardest parts of what we're doing is figuring out what are those affordances that people want, right? And so originally we existed before like GitHub Copilot Chat, and we're kind of starting with bringing something that was very resistant to being the chat experience, right? Because similar to everyone, are like, chatbot can't be the way that developers want to interface with these models. But what we found is so many developer tools, right? The most popular developer tool, probably even till today, like remains ChatGPT, right? And so that's often the introduction. And so people bring those intuitions when they begin to adopt these tools within IDEs. Mm-hmm. And so starting with something that's similar, but like you'll notice like with Continue, there's no like AI assistant that responds and it doesn't have a personality and things like that. It's more thinking about it like an extension of you, right? Like you're asking yourself the question, and then you yourself is going in an automated way, kind of trying to give you an answer. And so it's very much kind of you iterating to get to a solution with the help of a tool, right? Not necessarily this agent that is working on your behalf. And that seems to be the thing that people are really using at this point. It's this edit experience, it's the chat. On a day-to-day basis, we're not seeing evidence of developers, like I've talked to thousands in the last year and a half since we've been working on Continue, and we're not seeing evidence of people kind of using other affordances yet. I think the most likely next one is when you could do like multi-file refactorings. Right now, a lot of what I'm describing is for individual code sections within one file. I think likely where things are going next, right, is the ability to edit multiple files at the same time. And I think that is a prerequisite for many of the exciting agent things people are doing. But what we're finding is outside of early enthusiasts, outside of early adopters, developers who just kind of want to get their job done are not using those kinds of tools. What they're using is these more in-flow things. And as those start to become more capable, I think we'll see people move towards maybe async workflows. But today it's really kind of the ones you're probably most familiar with, autocomplete, chat, and edit as the initial affordances. And what we really need is for model capabilities to improve. We need developer tools like ourselves to be doing more work on trying to figure out the UI UX. And we need developers like beginning to learn how to use LLMs. Like that's the key thing here, is that developers each have their own knowledge and experience level. So like you need to kind of decide for yourself, like when would this be faster for me to do manually because you have 20 years of experience, and when is it something that you rely on the model for? And it really depends on you as an individual. So it requires some amount of play. And that's really what we're trying to enable with our affordances today. Enable developers to play, do it in an open way, build a community around it, and figure out kind of the affordances together with that developer community.
So Michael, you and Ollama, I envision very much living at kind of the edge of everything, right? Because maybe that's just your brand. I'm a user, I'm very impressed with what Ollama provides, and I love that I can just have these different models and I can swap them in, swap them out. From your perspective, like what's burgeoning, what's cutting edge, what's interesting in the world of Gen AI for specifically developers that you've been watching?
Yeah, I think earlier last year, we started seeing a lot of chat apps being created. And fast forward to today, I think most of the applications are focused on RAG use cases, so retrieval augmented generation. And we're starting to see a lot of people starting to build with agent-like capabilities inside their application. So we see that shift.
And how far away are the agents? When can we see some actual agents that are like doing what they're supposed to do?
So on the Ollama front, we're trying to work really hard to make sure the Ollama API enables these application developers to build agents. And I think we got some ways to go to enable them from the model itself all the way to the tooling that's coming. But we're starting to see many being built now.
Awesome. So Gabe, when it comes to the Granite models, you said they're language models, but they have some coding facilities. How would you describe that?
Yeah, so one of the beauties of these things is, the beauty of these things is that they don't have to be built for purpose, right? You can train lots of different tasks into a model, and as long as the modality is the same, it doesn't require any fancy gymnastics. Now, when you get into multimodal models, which will be coming in the Granite line, then you have some gymnastics around what does a token mean for an image, what does a token mean for a piece of speech, but the code is still tokens, right? And so these models are trained on the same code tokens that the code specific models were. They're just also trained with a much more robust language data set. And right now, this 3.0 release that we did, the models still have short context, which is probably their biggest shortcoming, which is why we're not yet recommending moving away from the code models, because for a lot of these code-based ones, the killer feature is context, right? So a lot of the stuff that Continue does is carefully curate what goes into that context so that the response the model gets can be as accurate as possible. Those long context Granite ones will be coming shortly. It's just you have to train the short context ones first, and then you can train the long context ones from there. And so it was really just trying to get these out so that they can help solve the use cases that they can solve right now with the short context. So that's how these models sort of become an all-in-one type of solution. There's a lot of detail about how the data gets mixed, how it got put together, how it got cleaned in the paper. You can find that through the README on Hugging Face. But the whole data model factory team at IBM has done a really remarkable job of building out a cutting-edge training pipeline for these things. So,
got it. So since Granite is open source,
asterisk,
right? For all intents and purposes, what would a fork look like? Like if I was gonna be like, I want a Granite fork, what would I do?
Great question. So I know we've got some folks also from IBM in the audience that have worked deeply on the InstructLab project. And so, there are a lot of different ways to derive from a model. The most obvious one is to do a fine-tune yourself or to tune an adapter. And that is, if you have a specific data set that you need to fork from, that is a great way to go. The InstructLab tooling that is coming out of IBM Research and Red Hat is another option here, which allows you to not only fork, but also merge. So it accomplishes this by essentially narrowing the scope of what the data can be to a schema of YAML files and making that data itself the merge point rather than the model, the merge point. So, if you look at Hugging Face, you get sort of lineage trees of the models. You can see what the parent was, what it was tuned from, but there's no merge points. It's just a pure tree, right? Whereas with InstructLab, the goal is to bring sort of a developer pull request flow to a model. So you're actually merging knowledge back into a common code base. And the place we see this having a lot of advantage is around organizations that want to customize a model, not just for one specific use, but for the organization in general, right? So again, the beauty of these models is they can do so many things at once. So why not bring all of your business's use case into one place and let it live over time? So that's another tool for getting a fork of your own that lives the way you want it to live. And finally, on that InstructLab front, there is currently an earlier rev of Granite that is being maintained as a community model using InstructLab. So there's a InstructLab 7B Granite model. We're in the works of figuring out how to update that for these new 3.0 models. Sort of by necessity, there's a lag there. But we will have sort of a community merged versions of these models that will live based on community contributions. So that's really another big piece of how we see this being an open source model, truly, where people can contribute to the training of the model itself.
Mm-hmm. So let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that I'm completely convinced that these three tools, all taste better together, and I'm ready and I want it, you know, shut up and take my money, only it's free. So shut up and take my time. What do I do? Where do I go? How does it work?
I think,
Anybody can answer that one.
I think you can boil it down to 3 bash commands. I think
Okay.
if you have Homebrew installed on your Mac, it's brew install Ollama. I know Michael just pointed me to you should actually download the app so you get auto updates. And then if you have VS Code, you can run VS Code CLI to install continue, and then you can pull Ollama, or pull Granite rather, and that's, I think, 3 commands.
3 commands.
So
And if you prefer GUIs, you can also go to the marketplace
Yeah,
for VS Code or JetBrains,
Right.
click install, and then click install for Ollama, and then I think Ollama pull. It is one command, sorry. You can't have it all in GUI. You do have to Ollama pull.
Yeah. Yeah. So on Ollama, it's literally Ollama run Granite 3, and you'll start downloading Granite models.
It's almost too easy.
dense because naming is hard.
Yes, they do have a couple Granite 3 models. So
That's actually an interesting segue, though, so I'll just tangent on that for a second.
Sure.
So one of the things that we love about Ollama in this case is the way it works across devices and the way it really brings models to places where they couldn't run before. And in some ways, the Granite series, right now we have 2 different architectures we're working with. One is a classic dense architecture, but the other one is a mixture of experts architecture, which frankly, as I was trying to get support for this into Ollama, I learned a whole lot about. And it provides a really fascinating way of having a model that has a certain number of parameters of knowledge baked in, but using a subset of those at inference time so that it runs with much better latency and much lower resource. So we have right now 2 mixture of experts models that you can put on much lighter devices, and they really still crank out the tokens, so to speak. So it's a great combination with Ollama that you can put on any of those devices and have them run.
Michael, can you speak more to what Ollama enables for model builders like IBM?
yeah, I think one of the focus for Ollama is portability across the ecosystem and the number of platforms. So right now we have announced partnership with AMD, NVIDIA, and Qualcomm as of recent in order to work on these devices. Then the expectation from developers is no matter which laptop or server you're running on, you should be able to install Ollama and have the model builder's model just run. And whether you want to start off with a MacBook or the latest Qualcomm laptop, or all the way to a Google Cloud Run serverless product with GPUs, you should be able to just use Ollama and run these models.
And Gabe, I think Bill addressed this initially, but if you could just highlight it, maybe even from your own perspective, why this initiative from IBM?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think IBM has a long storied history in open source, and you know, certainly as a very large company, we have a long storied history in lots of things, but open source has been at the core of many of the places where IBM has been most impactful in the technology space. And I think in this world of generative AI models, it really touches on one of the things that IBM we pride ourselves on, and also is one of the things that differentiates us as we go into conversations with customers, which is around building trust. And I can tell you, having worked closely with teams in IBM that are trying to even define the words trust in AI, it's really, really hard. And especially in the world of generative AI, it becomes in some ways even harder because you're dealing with volumes of data that simply cannot be inspected by humans. So to us, that's where these things being open is so critical, because it's not just the trust of how the model works on a moment-to-moment basis. And of course, we're working on that with our Guardian models. I was just talking to Michael about work we're doing in open source to try and actually put moderations in front of your inference call and behind your inference call so it can run inline. But it's also trust in the process so that people can actually see into how your models get built, how your applications get built, and can understand it. Because I think when people understand something, it becomes less mystical, and you just natively build trust in it. So the trust factor for us is huge here.
Yeah. Well, I have one more question for Ty, but before that, I will say we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A from the audience. So if you do have thoughts or questions, be thinking of them, raise your hand, and I will furiously run a microphone to you after Ty answers this question. When can I use continue in Vim?
Soon. It is highly requested. I think the community's already put up a NeoVim PR.
Okay, start.
That is a start. And there's a long tail from Visual Studio is very popularly requested, Eclipse. The plan is to standardize the interface between AI and developers, so we will go to all IDEs eventually. Maybe we'll build our own IDE, and so we will get there, but we're a pretty small team. We're 5 at the moment. So JetBrains and VS Code keeps us busy. Once we grow a little bit bigger, we'll start to add on more IDEs and more text editors. So stay tuned.
Awesome. All right. If you have a question, raise your hand. I will bring you the mic. You guys want to share one of those? Yeah, we'll share. Still on? Yes.
Thank you.
Hey, I was wondering on the evaluation side of things, have you all thought about submitting your model to like Chatbot Arena leaderboard or?
Yeah, great question. We are the 3.0 announcement for the Granite models was last Monday, so we're actively working on building up. And yes, the answer is yes. It will be done. Just hasn't been done yet.
Anything else you can say around evaluation?
Yeah, I mean the paper has a detailed breakdown of the evals that were run and how they stack up against other models. You know, in terms of the different model sizes themselves, it's somewhat what you would expect. You know, our 8B is the most performant model, and I think I forget exactly which benchmark it was being run on, but the it was slightly higher than 3.1, sorry, Ollama 3.1, and I think at the time that they were run, 3.2 wasn't out yet, so we don't have those comparative benchmarks yet. But and then you know they drop off based on size and architecture slightly from there, but they're all competitive with their sibling models in the open weights arena.
Thank you.
I was looking at the available models on the Ollama site, and I see the Granite 3 Mixture of Experts and the Granite 3 Dense are both available. And they have different tunings or specializations. So what I use the Mixture of Experts model, which is lighter weight for autocomplete, and use Dense for sidebar chat instruct.
Yeah, that's a great breakdown. So I personally use the 8B dense and the 3B dense for those two functionalities, but the Mixture of Experts, depending on your laptop, can be an excellent choice in that as well. And really right now, those small Mixture of Experts models are going to crank out your fastest performance. And so I think, again, big beefy MacBook, right? But I think the 1B was cranking out, pushing 200 tokens a second, and the 3B was at like 160 or something like that, on very anecdotal testing, mind you. But yeah, so I think but that's a good mental model in terms of when to choose a lightweight model versus a deeper weight model, something that's going to involve more long-form synthesis. You're going to want something a little bigger, and you have maybe a bigger latency tolerance, right? Versus you want your autocomplete to be lightning fast. So I think it's a great mental model.
Got a couple questions. One question is for all three of you. Last night there was a talk about funding and the open source model, and I was curious to hear how are your 3 projects funded as open source models? And then I have a question specifically for Michael. We know that about the Docker there's Ollama running in a Docker container now, right? And so my team was wondering specifically if there has been a lot of experience by other teams to use Ollama locally for development, but then basically use that as the hardware abstraction layer for basically deploying applications to a horizontally scaled Ollama via like Kubernetes or something along those lines. If that you've seen that, or if that was part of your intention with the Docker container.
Yeah, so I guess I'll answer the second question first. We do have partnership with Docker folks, and we're actually the team who originally built the old Docker desktop line of products. So our intention is that people will be able to deploy Ollama inside containers, whether it's direct Docker container or inside Kubernetes, and those are all fair game.
And to answer the question regarding funding, Continue is a venture-backed company by Y Combinator and HeavyBit, and a number of open source and dev tool angels. And the kind of approach to figuring out like how do we make this commercial open source project work is to have the bright line test of anything that's individual, anything that runs entirely locally on your computer, that is open source, Apache 2.0, that is free and will remain free. And then things for teams, our paid product is called Continue for Teams, for organizations kind of around governance, control, visibility that help you to roll it out to the team and understand it. Those pieces are part of the paid product that enables us to invest more into the open source, which grows the community and results in more enterprises showing up who pay for Continue for Teams. And so the goal is to build a sustainable community and sustainable project in that fashion.
Yeah, and I suppose we have a pretty different funding story relative to these fine folks here, which I'll let Bill explain any details about that one. But you know, I think the question about why open for IBM is really the root of it, right? IBM is a big enough company that we have funding streams that come from lots of different places inside our various different lines. And the critical thing is to have an AI model that sits at the heart of them and is open and is trusted, right? So for us, it's not about the model itself generating revenue, it's about the model building the trust that allows and enables everything else we do.
Yeah, for Ollama, we're also a Y Combinator funded company.
Still figuring it out? Still figuring it out? Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I have one question. I want to develop one SART-based applications. Which open API going for use? Ollama or ChatGPT, or which one best for that scalable application?
Sorry, would you be able to repeat that question?
Yeah, I want to develop one chart-based application. I can go for Ollama or OpenAPI. Which one good for security and observability, everything fine for that one? Example, that lot of application not giving proper response. LLM model giving, if you give the long lengthy word, it's throwing an error. Like kind of situation, which I can use. I can go for Ollama or other.
So I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's when would you make the choice between using a closed as a service model versus a local Ollama model?
Yeah.
It's a great question, and I think it's actually kind of the root of the origin story for how we all got to know each other was literally, you know, another colleague of mine is around here. He manages github.com/IBM, and he gets multiple requests a day for installing GitHub Copilot on that, which is not approved by IBM for usage for the security and compliance reasons. And so someone asked yet again, like, can we use Copilot? Are there any other tools like that that we can use? And rather than escalating it to JJ, because I know he gets enough of those requests, I said, let me see if there's something we can do that runs purely locally. So those constraints around not letting your data leave your laptop, not letting your proprietary information leave your domain are really one of the critical reasons you would choose to do something on device. Certainly latency and portability is another big element to it. You are definitely going to get richer responses from a hosted system just because the models are going to be bigger and because the whole system around the model is going to be more complex.
Just to add to this, I think with Ollama, there's OpenAI API compatibility. So within a single line of code, you can switch between the two. And from what we've seen in terms of open source models, there's three primary components when you start choosing open source models. Number one is latency. Number two is privacy. So all your data is private, local to your environment, whether that's local on your desktop or locally on your private cloud. Or private public cloud. And the third one is intellectual property. Should you choose to fine tune, say on Granite's model, and it is Apache 2.0, you own that end result model. So those are the main three primary components that we see.
Yeah, and I would say the best way to figure it out is to play with them. So when it comes to Continue, you can use proprietary models. So you can plug in your GPT 4.0 API key or Cloud Sonnet API key if you want to use those, or you can use Ollama, right? And you can switch back and forth. You can always be changing it up. And so that's a kind of a core thesis, right? Is enable people to play with a bunch of different ones, and you'll start to figure out for different use cases, for different workflows, when and where it makes sense to use Ollama models, run models versus kind of proprietary models.
Excellent. We got time for one more. Did you already ask a question? He hasn't asked one yet.
Thank you. So kind of question for all three of you. So, I think you've all done some awesome work, like getting these models to run like on device on, even my MacBook Air, which is like small, low resource, but it works great. Trends you see in like the open source or Llama derivative model development, like, are there any improvements in like latency, efficiency, like RAM usage that you feel like maybe this year later on will be beneficial for the tools you're working on?
We definitely notice a trend of smaller models. All the major research labs have released their on-device models in the 1 to 3 billion parameter models. And latency, this is something that we're actively working on with our partnership with the hardware providers. So this is something that we're working on to improve performance.
Yeah, I think that's a really accurate one. I think for us, the mixture of experts architecture is one that we're leaning into heavily for exactly this reason. And I would just say one of the other things that I love about Ollama as a tool is that it's intelligently inspects what you have in your system, and it'll try to make the best choice about. It's all based on technology that can split your model over a GPU and a CPU, so it's not an either-or decision. You don't have to say, do I have a big enough GPU to handle this model? It'll figure out how to lay it out for you, and it'll give you the best performance that you can get. And I know you guys are always working on that piece and like driving that down. So.
And what we're finding with AI code assistants is they're generally not using one model. It's not like a chat model that powers everything. There's like an autocomplete model, embeddings model, re-ranking model. There's an apply model that like moves it over. So as these models specialize, I think they'll be more likely to be able to be run on device or on your server using open source models. And so as kind of the models get more performant, I think we'll see that. So autocomplete's a good example. Even if you use one of these other tools that don't tell you what models they use, generally, as far as I've been able to figure out, they're between 1 and 15 billion parameters, which if you've played around with open source models, like those are roughly the size that you can bring onto your laptop. And so as the laptops get better, we have to figure out the power consumption issue, right? So you probably want to be plugged in if you're using them for a while, but I think a lot of autocomplete workloads are going to actually move local because it doesn't make sense to go to the cloud and come back and not use the compute you already paid for. So I think over time, as the models get better and as the resources get more abundant, we're going to see workloads, probably autocomplete first, move to local.
All right, that is our time. I'm sure these guys would love to field more questions afterward. Just approach them. I'm sure they'd love to talk more about it. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today, and have a good rest of your day.